The old man held his adorable grandson for the first time. Suddenly he sensed something was wrong around them. His eyes darted around nervously as if searching for invisible threats in the yard. He started feeling the ground with his hands. He even paced the open space carefully, measuring distances with his feet. Fenton assumed his father simply disliked the new property. But in truth, the old man loved the place. What truly bothered him was where the house was built. All three were left confused by his strange behavior. As Fenton carried luggage into the house, Brian pleaded with his mom, hoping Grandpa could take him to explore the yard. But Jolene shook her head gently, knowing Grandpa was exhausted from the long trip. She comforted Brian and suggested he play by himself for now. But Brian tossed his old toys aside, feeling completely uninterested. He grumbled that he missed their home in Chicago, where his friends were always nearby. Grandpa overheard Brian's loneliness and felt a pang of sympathy. He gave Brian a secret little nod, inviting him to sneak outside together. Brian's eyes lit up and he hurried to follow Grandpa out the door. Fenton had bought a large piece of land for the family, hoping to start a new life. But this land once belonged to Native Americans long ago. Brian wandered through the tall grass, letting his imagination run wild. He pictured himself discovering buried treasures lost to time. Just then, Grandpa Clyde dug up something from the earth that caught Brian's attention. Brian was convinced it was an ancient arrowhead left by Native Americans. But in reality, it was just a rusty railroad spike. Once upon a time, a train used to race right through these fields. The train was called the Highball Express, a legend around these parts. They crouched by what used to be the tracks, now lost beneath grass and earth. Brian spotted a corroded metal part and wondered if something terrible had happened here. Grandpa's eyes grew serious as he told Brian this was the very place where the Highball Express derailed. When Grandpa was Brian's age, disaster struck this very place. The train was moving too fast, and not a single person survived the crash. Brian listened with wide-eyed shock, struggling to picture the tragedy. Grandpa raised a finger to his lips, motioning for silence. He pressed his ear to the ground, as if the past could still be heard in the earth. For a long moment, everything was still as Grandpa's eyes widened in fear. He acted like he could hear something no one else could. He glanced nervously over his shoulder, unsettled by what he'd sensed. He whispered that things were far worse than he had ever imagined. Grandpa hurried down the old path, retracing steps from decades ago. If his memory was right, the path of the old train lined up exactly with their new home. Brian waved his hands in excitement, thinking this was just another adventure. But Grandpa pointed straight at their house, his face grave and worried. Suddenly, all his fears about the house's location made sense. That evening, Brian played with his toy trains. Still thinking about Grandpa's story, he asked why the real train had derailed all those years ago. Grandpa slowly began to share the memory that haunted him. As a child, he'd traveled to Sioux City to visit his own grandfather, but the train he was waiting for never arrived. So little Clyde lay down on the tracks, afraid he'd miss it if he looked away. He waited for so long that he eventually fell asleep right there. The train rumbled closer, its whistle screaming through the air. But even the deafening sound didn't wake Clyde. The engineer saw the boy and slammed on the emergency brake. But the massive train couldn't stop in time and jumped the rails. Clyde woke to find the wreckage only 50 feet away. Fenton listened quietly from outside, feeling the weight of his father's regret. The cries of the passengers faded away into silence. Grandpa's voice trembled with guilt and sorrow. Brian could feel the heavy burden Grandpa carried. Grandpa said that tonight, the 407 train would return to finish what began 75 years ago. The train would take him somewhere far, far away. Brian couldn't grasp what Grandpa meant. He asked when Grandpa would come back, not wanting to let go. Grandpa looked at him with deep seriousness and said he would never return. In that moment, Brian finally understood. They hugged each other tightly, not wanting the moment to end. Fenton overheard them and thought his father was just imagining things. A train from 75 years ago couldn't possibly come back, he told himself, and it certainly couldn't smash into their new home. Grandpa just wanted to keep his family safe, but there wasn't time to move everything out. If Brian had anything precious, he'd better pack it up now. After thinking it over, Brian decided what mattered most was Grandpa himself. Night soon fell, wrapping the house in quiet tension. Grandpa focused on drawing the train's old route, his hands steady but his heart racing. That's when the doctor arrived, ready to give Grandpa a checkup. But Grandpa insisted there was no time to waste. Everything valuable had to be moved out before it was too late. Everyone was baffled by Grandpa's urgency. unable to understand his fear. No one believed the train would really come that night. Grandpa explained that earlier he had done what he did as a child. He had listened to the rails and heard a sound he could never forget. That's how he knew the train would stop there tonight. Still, nobody believed him. The doctor didn't understand how a train could possibly appear. Grandpa pulled an old ticket from his pocket. The paper yellowed with age. Brian took the ticket, studying every faded detail in disbelief. Everyone stared, amazed. Grandpa had kept it for 75 years. Suddenly, Grandpa felt a sharp prick in his arm. The doctor had given him a sedative while he wasn't looking. Grandpa insisted he couldn't fall asleep now, or he would miss the train again. The doctor told him not to worry. There would always be another train. Brian shouted that they couldn't do this to Grandpa, who had already missed his chance once. Jolene tried to comfort Brian, promising Grandpa would be okay and just needed to rest. Fenton was troubled, wondering if everyone ended up like this when they got old. Brian pinned the ticket to the wall and tried to copy Grandpa, pressing his ear to the toy tracks. He lay there until sleep finally took him. Dawn broke, and the family was lost in their dreams. Suddenly, a piercing train whistle shattered the morning calm. The whole house began to tremble as if the earth itself was moving. Brian bolted awake and ran to the window in disbelief. He saw a rail train racing straight toward their home. He shouted for his parents to wake up, his voice trembling with fear. His parents thought it was just a bad dream and didn't take him seriously. Brian tore the ticket off the wall and raced downstairs to Grandpa. The train was closing in, faster and faster. Grandpa was still lost in sleep, unaware of the danger. Brian shook him with all his strength until Grandpa finally woke up. The thunderous noise brought Fenton and Jolene running down the stairs. They were all stunned to see the train bearing down on their home. Brian clung to his suitcase, panic building in his chest as he begged Grandpa to move faster. Everyone in the living room stood in stunned silence, unable to process what was happening. Only at the very last second did Fenton and Jolene pull Grandpa and Brian out of danger. The train crashed straight through their living room, shattering everything in its path. The engineer looked out the window and greeted them with a polite wave and a warm smile, as if nothing was wrong. Grandpa Clyde stepped forward, his eyes shining with a mix of fear and anticipation. After 75 years, he was finally ready to face the past. Jolene could hardly believe what she was seeing, her mind struggling to catch up. Inside the train, passengers wore clothing from another era, frozen in time. The conductor appeared, calling for tickets in a voice that echoed through the car. Brian handed over the ticket, desperate to follow Grandpa. Grandpa gently told him no, that he no longer belonged on this side. Tonight, Grandpa had to board the train alone. He told Brian as long as he remembered these stories, Grandpa would always be with him. They promised to meet again someday in the distant future. Grandpa asked politely if he could board the train. The conductor replied that as long as you have a ticket, the door will always open. Grandpa turned back for one last look at his family, his eyes filled with gratitude and regret. He quietly apologized for all the trouble he had caused them over the years. With a deep breath, Grandpa finally stepped onto the train, beginning his final journey home. His family watched as the train faded into the distance, swallowed by the morning light. They stood together in silence, waving one last farewell as Grandpa disappeared from view.